Chapter 2. After school, Rohan rode to the edge of town, wearing a fresh bruise on his eye socket, and pushed his bike into the bushes at the base of Baker's Hill. Baker's Hill rose up from the farmers' fields and was unusually steep and narrow, with a flat top. The hill was the only distinguishing feature of Baker's Ridge, which was a small, isolated place wedged between two mountains, one to the northwest and one to the east. Rohan followed a steep rocky track that snaked its way through the shrubs and trees to the plateau. Puffing, and with his eye throbbing even more than before, he arrived at the boulder which perched atop the hill like an enormous marble. Without pause, he climbed the boulder and sat up on it in a huff, and from there he stared out blankly over the town. Rohan rested his elbows on his knees and thought back over the day, remembering his most recent encounter with Titus. He recalled how the arrogant boy, once he had untangled himself from the chair and scrambled to his feet, had flattened him with one punch to the face in front of everyone, and not one person had stood up for him, except Eve, of course. And then there was the beating Titus had given him in the bike shelter. Rohan flared his nostrils and huffed out a breath. With the confrontations playing over and over in his head, Rohan gritted his teeth and slid down from the boulder. He was fuming as he marched across and kicked at a nearby rock, sending it flying over the edge of the cliff. The sound of it crashing down, smashing against the side of the hill, was strangely satisfying. He lined up another rock then, a larger one this time, and gave that a kick too, grunting with the effort. It soared way out into the air before beginning its downward descent. Rohan stood looking down after it, frowning. He was surprised at how far it had gone. He was revved up now, this felt good, and picturing Titus's overgrown face on a third rock, Rohan took a run up and launched it over the side of the hill, giving it all he had. It flew out in front of him for a good 40 or so yards before curving towards the earth. He rushed across to the edge and watched as it fell away to become a small dot. The rock had travelled such a distance that when it finally did hit the ground, it had missed the side of the hill altogether and crashed directly into the flat earth of the field below. Rohan's heart was racing. He couldn't understand how he was doing this. Leaning down, he picked up another of the many rocks scattered around the dusty terrain to examine it. This one was as large as a football, and judging by the size of it, Rohan suspected he should have been struggling a lot more to lift the thing. He chucked the rock in the air a few times and caught it easily. Then, with a bit of effort, he launched it as high as one of the nearby trees, and when it came down again, he managed to catch it in his arms without hurting himself or even coming close. This was crazy. No, this was impossible. The picture of Titus's grinning gob flashed through his mind yet again, making Rohan's blood boil afresh. He pulled back his arm and catapulted the rock he still held out over the cliff. It sailed through the air at great speed, flying further than he had ever thrown even a tennis ball before, at least twice or 3 times as far. His mouth dropped open in astonishment. This couldn't be real. He felt panicked, his heart hammering away in his chest. But Rohan didn't stop. He found an even bigger rock then, this one the size of a watermelon, and picking it up with ease, he turned to hurl the thing at the boulder he had just been sitting on. The rock struck its surface with great force, shattering into 1,000,000 pieces. Rohan was astounded. His thoughts were all in a jumble. He had just come up here to kick or punch something, so his head wouldn't explode with the tension that had been building up since the morning. He had never expected to discover this about himself, but Rohan had no idea what it was he had actually discovered. He threw countless more rocks at the boulder and over the side of the hill before he couldn't lift another thing, and he finally began to feel his anger from the day subside. In the silence of the afternoon, with the rays of the falling sun turning the sky orange and purple at the horizon, Rohan stood there gazing out over the town as before. He took in some deep breaths to steady himself, drenched in sweat and shaking. Curling up an arm, he pulled back the sleeve of his t-shirt and gazed down at his bicep. He shook his head. There was no mistaking it now. He could tell that he had gotten stronger, but it was obviously more than that. Something had clearly happened to him. But what? Was it the chemicals seeping out of plastics? Or maybe the hormones they fed to chickens? What he was able to do was far from normal, and it scared him. Over the next few weeks, Rowan's head was filled almost constantly with thoughts of how he had come to be in his present situation. He was so distracted he could hardly hold a conversation with Eve or with his parents, and his schoolwork was suffering badly from neglect. Each day after school, Rowan headed up Baker's Hill to throw some more rocks around. It felt good to be up there alone, but it felt even better to smash things. It made him feel powerful, especially on the days he had been unable to avoid a beating from Titus. Despite having become freakishly strong, Rowan was still no fighter, and he still somehow failed to defend himself against the big brute. Rowan strolled into his homeroom and took a seat beside Eve in the front row. He shot her a small smile before turning away. He was sure she knew something was up by now. How could she not? He was a mess. Perhaps he needed to put some distance between the two of them for a while, he thought, at least until things settled down and he figured out what on earth was happening to him. "Rowan, where have you been? What's going on?" Eve asked, the worry evident in her voice. "You were gone half of last week, and you promised we could get together over the weekend. Are you okay? I mean, you seriously don't look okay." He had been distant with her in class and during lunch times, and outside of school he had managed to avoid her almost entirely for days, or was it weeks? He had lost track. Rowan wouldn't look at Eve when he answered. "Yes, I'm fine," he snapped. But he wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. It was unnatural. His body was puffing up, and people were bound to start noticing if they hadn't already. He thought he should probably buy some weights to lift at home, and maybe be seen to be doing push-ups about the place too, so at least there would be an excuse for his sudden change in physique. Eve sat quietly beside Rowan for the next few minutes, as more people trailed into the room. "Is it something I've done?" she asked next. Rowan glanced around at Eve, who looked up at him unhappily. He felt guilty. He had shut her out almost entirely, yet wasn't this the type of thing you were supposed to share with a best friend? Except he didn't really have a choice. He couldn't tell her. So if she thought he was mad at her, Rowan decided that maybe that was the best thing for the moment. He gave Eve a steady frown and grumbled, "No." This seemed to put her off because she said nothing more until they headed off to their first class for the day. "Is it Titus?" Eve tried again as they walked along the halls. Kids darted everywhere and Rowan was unable to get away from her. "Did he punch you again?" He had, but that wasn't the main problem. Rowan was working on a lie, but she was too quick. "Rowan, stop," said Eve, coming around to stand in front of him. "No, Eve, it's nothing," he said impatiently, his voice raised. Some of the kids walking nearby glanced at them and snickered into their hands. Eve stood still, gazing up at Rowan, looking surprised at his tone. "Look, just..." he growled. Now she seemed hurt, and Rowan felt bad, really bad. "Just leave me alone!" He turned in a huff and stormed away down the hall. What could he say? During that class and for the rest of the day, Eve sat apart from Rowan. He glanced back at her from the front row, and when their eyes met, he thought he saw them glisten with tears before she lowered her head, her hair sliding forward to cover her face. Rowan felt so terrible he almost resolved to tell her everything. But he knew he shouldn't, not yet. He might be turning into a monster for all he knew. He was familiar with the Incredible Hulk and numerous other superheroes who morphed into beings they couldn't entirely control. And what about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? Rowan's mind was spinning. No, he couldn't let Eve in. She was much safer staying away from him, even if she didn't know it. At the end of school, Rowan noticed Eve following him out the front gate, but he didn't stop. "Rowan, wait!" she called out, jogging after him, dodging through the crowd of kids. "I've got to go," he mumbled over his shoulder, not slowing down. "Wait, where are you going?" He didn't answer. He rushed along the sidewalk, hoping she would just give up. Every second she persisted just made him feel like a bigger jerk. "What's wrong? Why are you avoiding me?" Eve called out loudly. Just then Titus pulled up on his bike in front of Rohan, cutting him off. He sat with one foot on the ground, watching Eve rush up behind them with amusement. "Lover's tiff?" he asked, chuckling. Rohan turned quickly to cross the street. The last thing he needed was that person butting in. "Shut your face, Titus!" Rohan heard Eve growl as he hurried away. That afternoon Rohan climbed up Baker's Hill, just as he had many times before. The day had upset him, more than usual. He didn't want Eve mixed up in this whole freaky business. His nerves were frayed. He had been on edge with his parents, afraid they would see something they shouldn't. Plus, he hadn't been sleeping lately, and now he just felt depressed and angry about everything. He bent to pick up the largest rock he could find. It was huge, and Rohan lifted it off the ground with only minimal effort. Using two hands, he slung it over the edge of the cliff, growling out in frustration as he let it go, watching it soar into the air. His mind was foggy with agitation. Then, with nostrils flared and huffing, he charged towards the large boulder. He crashed up against it, leaning into its cold surface with all of his might. To begin with, the boulder wouldn't budge, but Rohan's anger gave him strength, and taking a breath, he growled out some more power. The enormous ball soon began to roll. He repositioned his sliding feet and gave another heave, making it creep along, inch by inch, towards the edge of the plateau. For several minutes he pushed and shoved and kept the thing moving until finally he felt his temper begin to peter out. Red-faced and panting, Rohan stopped. What was he doing? If the boulder rolled down there, it might kill someone. Shaking, he turned his back on it and let himself crumple to the ground, tears prickling at the corner of his eyes. His reality had been tilted on its axis so much that he no longer recognized himself. He felt confused most of the time these days about who he was, about what was real, what he was supposed to do now. He sat there, slumped over his knees, feeling lost and alone. He began to sob, and soon 2 lines of moisture trailed down his cheeks. His life was spiraling out of control, and there was nothing he could do about it. Just then, Rohan was startled out of his misery when he heard a voice coming from nearby. His head snapped up quickly and he wiped at his tears. "So, this is what you've been up to, Fraser." The figure of Titus appeared around the rock, his face plastered with an obnoxious smirk. "Your little girlfriend probably thinks you've dumped her, you know." Rohan avoided looking at him directly, conscious that his eyes were most probably red from crying. "She's not my girlfriend," he grumbled, drying his cheeks. That dirtbag had followed him up there, but Rohan didn't care what he might do to him now. If Titus tried anything, this time he would flatten him. "Calm down, buddy," Titus said. "Well, what about this thing? What's the deal then? Are you Superman or something?" So, Titus had seen. Yet he didn't seem alarmed by what he had just witnessed. He just continued to sneer. Rohan frowned. He was in no mood for Titus's smart mouth. He still breathed heavily as he wiped roughly at the sweat on his brow. "How'd you do that shit, rolling this big mother?" "Are you like a robot, Fraser?" Titus asked, snickering as he sauntered closer. Rohan got to his feet and turned to face the self-important, overgrown boy. Titus came right up close to him and reached out a finger, poking him hard in the chest. Rohan just stood there, scowling, feeling himself beginning to shake with anger. "Nope, you feel human to me," Titus said, grinning. "Scientists would want to do experiments on you if they knew about this, or they might just chuck you in a prison." He turned away from Rohan casually and began strolling backwards and forwards in front of him. Then, in the voice of someone presenting a nature documentary, he said, "We are still uncertain how the freaky boy from Baker's Ridge moved that 10-ton rock, but scientists believe it is part of a mating ritual to attract the Lawson girl." "Shut up!" Rohan spat. What he could do was unnatural, and they might lock him up. "You can't tell anyone. Don't you dare tell anyone! He began to feel frightened as he ran through in his mind the various unpleasant scenarios. Titus stopped his pacing and suddenly turned on him. "Did you just tell me what to do?" he said, taking a step towards Rowan again, his voice having switched from light-hearted to menacing in a mere second. No, stuttered Rowan, his confidence of a moment ago having all but drained away. "Meet me here tomorrow after school, Fraser, or I will tell." What for?" he asked. "And no one would believe you, even if you did tell." Titus glared at him. "Meet me here, or I crush your shiny new bike." "Do you think I'd ever take that to school again?" "Just do it, or I'll crush you." Titus walked up to Rowan, staring him dead in the eye, as he took a tight hold of his collar, twisting it in his fist. Rowan could feel tears returning to his eyes. He just wanted to get out of there. Okay, whatever, I'll meet you here," he whined, trying not to make it sound like he was choking.